In this section, I want to walk through some of the examples of action that you can take and the benefits they're going to have to your business beyond just sustainability and decarbonisation. We're going to walk through the 5 key areas of your business as we discussed earlier, and we're going to start off with energy and buildings. Before we get stuck in though, what I wanted to do is really explain some of the changes we've seen over the past 10-15 years to demonstrate that 50% or 90% reduction is actually possible. If we look at coal and the electricity generation in the UK, around 2012 we were generating around 40% of our electricity from burning coal. In the past 10 years or 12 years since then, that's changed quite dramatically and that's reduced down heavily, and we've seen wind really take off. So in 2012, around 500 grams or half a kilo of carbon dioxide would be emitted for every kilowatt hour of electricity that you used. If we look at 2022, that had reduced down to 180 grams or 0.18 kilos for every kilowatt hour that you would use. That is a 65% reduction in around 10 years, demonstrating that actually that 50% reduction by 2030 or 90% reduction by 2045, 2050 is achievable and possible with the technology that we have right now. If we look at that as going forward to 2030, and this is really key to remember why that 2019 baseline is there as well. So if we compare a 2019 year where we had around 190 grams of emissions for every kilowatt hour and compare that to last year, so if you baselined your 2019 and your 2023 energy usage or electricity usage, we would have seen around a 20% reduction in that without you changing much in your business. So already there's some historical wins that you can achieve there, which is the benefit of going back and reducing that. If we project forward to 2030 on that same trajectory, it might be that we're as low as 100 grams of emissions per kilowatt hour of electricity, again around a 46% reduction there. So we start to see the changes stack up as the grid decarbonises. I've mentioned LEDs already as a good example of this, but if you pick up a packet of a light bulb, it will typically say 100 watts equivalent or something similar to that, and will actually then have the rating, which is around 10 watts. Again, a 90 or 89.5%, 90% reduction there, just by swapping out those light bulbs. And that is going to reflect in your electricity bills as well. They're using 10% of the amount of power. Your bills will go down by 90% or be 10% lower as well. One that often gets forgotten is smart plugs. These are little devices that sit just between the walls. So if you've got a laptop, you plug it into the smart plug, then plug it into the wall as normal. The smart plug will then normally connect to something like your phone, or sometimes like a Wi-Fi network, via either to your phone via Bluetooth, or sometimes to a Wi-Fi network to give you energy data here on how much you're using. This is really useful for two reasons, because one, you can start to automate and schedule the usage of electricity and of devices, and two, you can start tracking how much power they use. For example, if you are in a co-working space, it might be you don't have access to electricity data, but you do have access to a plug socket, and therefore if you can use a smart plug, while you can't track the entire building's electricity usage, you might be able to track individual devices within your office space to understand what energy they're using and how much emissions they might be consuming as a result. If we look at the example of a TV that's on the wall, that might be drawing around 15 watts of electricity while it's in use, and if that's idling in the background, that without a smart plug might be costing around £3 a month in power. So not a huge amount, but enough to add up. Obviously that's on 24 hours a day because it might be in an office where you can't turn it off. But if you've got a smart plug and then started scheduling it so that people didn't forget to turn it off at the end of the day, and it automated that so it's only on for 8 hours a day when it's in use, that can cut that power usage down to just £1 a month. Now these devices are normally 10, 15, 20 pounds, and if you're saving £2 on just one device, they start to pay themselves back relatively quickly, and they're also a really good way to engage your team on the reduction actions, and as I mentioned, can help you calculate the emissions if you don't have access to energy bills. If we look at transport now commuting is going to be a really big part of your footprint, and if you've got 20 employees that are travelling to work 3 days a week, they might be travelling around 10 miles a day on average. That's around 1,500 miles a year. And this is what it looks like if we start combining that carbon footprint, and this is in tonnes per year. So if you've got even a large petrol car, such as a Range Rover, that might generate around if all 20 employees were driving a large car, such as a Range Rover, that might be around 13 tonnes of emissions. If you started to swap those out for small petrol cars, that can almost halve the emissions even from using smaller cars. Or ideally, if you go into like an electric car, that's around a 80% reduction. Or if you can move into public transport or even an e-bike, that's also a really big reduction. So you start to see these big changes of 80-90% being possible with existing technology. One thing I'd recommend here as well is it is about behaviour change as much as it is technology. So even if you start cycling into work 1 day a week out of 5, that is a 20% reduction as well in your footprint. So don't think of this as all or nothing. During winter, it's going to be much harder to get people to cycle into work, but even doing that a few days a week during the summer might help reduce your emissions down. So don't overlook this. Equally, things like car sharing are a great way to reduce emissions down. If you've got 3 people travelling in one car, that's exactly the same emissions as if that one person was driving in one car, but you've just reduced those emissions down by 66% because you've got 2 out of 3 people going there. So again, there's a lot of quick wins that you can have here. Something else I'm a big fan of is electric cargo bikes. These are great for urban areas, and it's thinking about how your goods that you're selling might be arriving with customers. If you look at a box like this is still classed as an electric bike. It's just got a big box on the back of it, and that can hold several hundred books or like t-shirts or magazines, whatever it is. If it's a small object you're selling, these devices can hold quite a lot, and that is a 96% reduction against things like delivery vans. There was a company we did some work with in London who were maintaining heating systems, and they swapped out their old diesel van for electric cargo bikes, and that was mostly driven because of a ULEZ zone. That actually saved them several £1,000s a year, and the bikes paid themselves back relatively quickly. It also meant they could get to jobs much quicker because they weren't stuck in traffic in vans. They were able to put a lot of their tools, which were relatively light and small, into an electric cargo bike and use that instead. It also means that anyone can ride them and may be able to free up diesel vans or other activities or other routes for other members of staff or for dedicated sort of routes. If you are moving pianos, for example, from Aberdeen to Brighton, an electric cargo bike is not going to cut it. You probably do need a diesel van for that, but by using an electric cargo bike, you might free up that diesel van to only do those routes, and you might be able to just decarbonise some of those shorter journeys that are being done. So understanding how you're moving around currently is really important as well. An example of that would be business travel. If we look at this, and this is around how many trips, like 1 tonne of CO2 buys you, so thinking of a carbon budget and go, well, if we've capped our emissions for business travel to 1 tonne, what does that look like? With that, you can either buy 25 train trips or you can buy 3 return flights. So again, it's exploring how you're using this and just building understanding into the team to make these decisions that are more effective and go, well, if we do need to go to London, getting the train might mean that we can use much more of that budget and send more of the team than if we were flying there because of the increased carbon intensity. I mentioned water usage earlier, and this is one to think about just because it is going to get more expensive over the next few years due to various reasons, climate change being a big one of those. And ultimately, the question is, do you need to be cleaning work vans with drinking water? Could it be actually that you are able to reuse water, capture water, using rainwater harvesting on your roof, and then use that for things like watering plants or washing vans or cars with, where you don't necessarily need highly processed, refined kind of drinking water? Mostly, it's going to save you money. Supply chain. I've only picked one example for this because it can get quite overwhelming, but if you look at something like catering for an event, I wanted to talk through the explanation here of a meat versus a vegan or kind of alternative meal, in the fact that the decisions you're making, the suppliers you are choosing, and the money you are spending is all a vote or it is all got an emission attached to it, and therefore you might be working with low carbon or high carbon organisations, and there's a difference there that's going to have knock-on impacts. So for example, if you did have a catering event where maybe you had 100 businesses around the table, this is what different footprints might start to look like accordingly. So per serving, a beef curry will have around 9 kilos of emissions attached to it, whereas a chicken curry might only have 1.2 kilos, or even like a vegan or vegetarian chicken curry might have half a kilo of carbon dioxide emissions attached to it. Therefore, the amount of money that you're spending on catering is going to have a direct impact on how much your emissions are creating as well. Beef curry is typically going to be more expensive, but also it's going to be much, much higher emissions. And this might be where you can start to influence your clients and start to understand, well, actually, this is going to really reduce your footprint down by making these decisions around 80 to 95% reduction. This is not necessarily saying remove meat entirely or remove beef entirely, but be considerate in what you're catering and how you're doing it. And that goes for catering, but also all aspects of your business as well. So any suppliers you're working with, start to engage them. They might be a high carbon supplier, they might be a low carbon supplier, in the same way they might be a high carbon or low carbon meal. Waste, this really is thinking about going beyond recycling, and typically waste is very hard to decarbonise. So what you want to actually be doing is reducing the amount of waste you're producing, looking at things like packages you send. Are they in the right size packages, or are you using oversized packaging? Are you throwing away items that might be able to be reused there? And a good example of this, I think, is cardboard boxes for removal companies. Whenever you move house, you'll typically buy a bunch of brand new cardboard boxes in and then recycle them at the end. How many people are doing that all the time when you've got things like supermarkets that might be buying in a huge amount of these goods as well? That was just a little bit of a walkthrough of some of the ideas of where you can start to reduce emissions in your business to get those ideas flowing, and give some context of how between 50 and 90% reductions are achievable with behaviour change and with existing technologies.